Hello and welcome to another episode or edition of Mattanory. Today this is a Midsummer's Eve as I record this. Midsummer and summer solstice can be used interchangeably, but they generally are seen as different things altogether. So summer solstice would be celebrated when the sun reaches its highest peak, which is always in between the 20th, 21st and 22nd of June, one of those days. Whereas the midsummer would be celebrated on the 24th. Now the dates have changed over the years, but there's been confusion between the Julian Gregorian calendars, so that's probably why it's been used interchangeably. But anyway, it doesn't really matter. Midsummer's Eve, it's a time of magic, it's a time of witches, fairies and of dancing. Now on the eve of midsummer, bonfires will be lit in praise of the sun, which is lovely. It's returned to us. The sun has begun to wane, so the people would light these fires and attempt to strengthen it. Another tradition is to pick roses. I've got some beautiful roses behind me. They smell delicious. It is said that any rose petal that is picked on this day will keep until Christmas. At midnight on Midsummer's Eve, young ladies can scatter rose petals before them and utter this charm. Rose leaves I strew. He that will love me, come after me now. And by the next day, Midsummer's Day, her true love will come and visit her. I've got a little visitor of myself, of a cat. You going to be all right? Okay, good. So if anybody's really into that and you're looking for true love, maybe tonight is the night to try and scatter those roses, and who knows who will come the next day. This story is called Jack and the Dancing Trees. So just wait for Nimue to settle down on my lap and then I think we can begin. Once upon a time, there was a young man named Jack. He worked on the estate of a wealthy laird. And although this laird had lots of money, he was quite miserly and he'd held onto it tightly, paying Jack just 1 penny a week for all his hard work. For the most part, Jack didn't mind. He lived in a cosy stone cottage with his mum, who was a canny old woman. She knew how to harvest berries from the hedgerows to make jams, how to spin fine yarn from the scraps of fleece left behind in the hedges and bushes and on the fences and that. And she could also make potent poultices out of the most ordinary plants. So, between his penny and the coins his mother collected after selling her jams and yarn and cures, they lived quite comfortably. But on the day this story takes place, which just happened to be a few days after the longest day of the year, Jack was sitting watching his laird's sheep and thinking about Jenny. Oh, Jenny. She worked as a maid in the laird's big old mansion house, and Jack fancied her. Fortunately, Jack had spoken to Jenny the other day, and she made it very clear that she fancied him right back. But it would take a lot more money than Jack could ever save on 1 penny a week to make a life for himself than Jenny. As this problem was going round and round in his head, there was a commotion of flapping wings and bird voices calling from out of the grove of trees that grew on a small hill near the field where he was sitting. Jack had learned the language of the birds from his mother, so he listened closely to what they were saying. "Tonight's the night," the sparrows were chirping. "Those trees will dance," agreed the crows. "With no thought for the feathered folk," creaked the magpie, fluffing out her feathers. "It only happens once every 100 years, shrilled the blackbird. "Dancing trees," chattered the jackdaw. "What will they think of next?" And with that, all the birds took off out of the trees and flew away. Jack was intrigued. What did his feather friends mean by dancing trees? He spotted his mum making her way across the field carrying some bread and cheese for his lunch. He met her and told her what he'd overheard. She nodded her head wisely. "I've heard tales that the big old oak tree up there pours himself out of the ground every 100 years on Midsummer's Eve and goes dancing with the young birch maidens that grow so coyly around him." She looked carefully round to make sure no one was there. It is also said that the trees keep treasures hidden amongst their roots, but a treasure seeker has to be careful not to lose himself in the seeking, or he could end up flattened. Here, take a ball of my yarn, she said with a wink. You never know, it might come in handy. As she walked back across the field, gathering stray bits of fleece, Jack looked at the ball of yarn and thought, seemed ordinary enough. What's going on? What does she mean? He shrugged and shoved it in his pocket. Jack! Someone called. He turned around and there was Jenny hurrying down the path from the mansion house. He waved and went to join her. I've come to warn you, said Jenny. She was a bit breathless. The lad's in a right old state, tearing up the place and muttering today's the day and getting crabby with everyone he comes across. You better be on your best behaviour today. Better yet, avoid him altogether. I've no idea what's gotten into him. I think I know, said Jack, and he filled her in on all what he learned. Don't do it, said Jenny. Do what? Asked Jack. I know what you're thinking, and it's too dangerous, she said, which is when Jack realised what he was going to do. He was going to stick around all night to see the trees dance. Jenny tried to get him to promise to go home as soon as his work was done. In the mood he's in, if the lad catches you snoop around his property, you could find yourself fired, or worse, she said. She hurried back to the mansion, not wanting to be caught herself. As dusk neared, Jack found a clump of bushes to hide behind, to settle down and wait. The evening was eerily quiet, with the birds all fled, but the sun sank towards the horizon. The notes of another worldly music filled the air. There was a sigh and a moan, a crack and a groan, and the huge oak tree that some called Old Groovy shook and rattled and heaved himself out the ground, his huge ropey roots moving in time to the music. The lovely white birch trees all on the hill began to shiver and shimmy along with him, until all 12 had shaken themselves right up the soil as well. The trees danced down the hill and across the field, pounding the ground as they moved. Jack was about to follow them when he saw a dark shadow creeping up the hill towards the holes that the trees had left behind. It looked like the lad. Jack snuck up the hill to find out what he was up to. He got there just in time to see the lad jump into the huge root hole that the oak tree had left behind. Jack peeked over the edge. The walls of the hole sparkled with gold and jewels, crowns and coins. The lad had a big sack, and he was throwing treasures into it as fast as he could. Jack crept over to the next hole, one left by a birch tree. It was much smaller and shallower, and there were few things gleaming in the moonlight. He thought about his sweetheart Jenny, and how much he wanted to marry her. He thought about his mother too, and how hard she worked to put food on their table, and to keep their house comfortable and warm. Far in the distance he could hear the strange music and the thumping of dancing trees. He'd be just down there for a minute or two. Plenty of time to get back out before the trees came back. So he jumped in. The hole was deeper than it seemed, and there were more jewels and gold than he'd thought. He plucked a large blue sapphire out the wall and put it in his pocket for his mum. A sprinkling of soil trickled onto his feet. He found a gold ring perfect for the size of Jenny's finger, and prized it loose, sending another cascade of dirt. Just as he put the ring in his pocket, Jenny appeared at the edge of the hole. "Jack!" she called. "You've got to get out now. The sky is getting lighter, and the sound of trees is growing closer." Jack tried to scramble up the side of the root hole, but the loose soil kept coming away under his finger. "Quickly!" cried Jenny. Jack remembered the ball of yarn his mum had given to him. He held one end and threw the rest up to Jenny. "Tie this onto a sturdy bush," she called. She nodded and disappeared from view. She reappeared, and he tugged on the yarn. It seemed strong enough, and hand over hand he pulled himself up out of the root hole. By the time he'd got out, the trees could be seen across the field, still dancing to the music, but heading back to their hill. Jack ran over to the big hill. The lad's sack was bulging, but he was still down there, cramming more treasure into it. "Lad!" Jack called to him, tying one of the ends of yarn to the bush and tossing the ball down the hole. "The trees are coming back. You've got to get out of there." The laird ignored Jack and the yarn. His eyes wide shone darkly as he continued to scrabble for the jewels in the dirt. Jenny tugged onto Jack's hand. The trees were dancing back up the hill. So Jack and Jenny had no choice. They ran as fast as they could down the other side, and they didn't stop running until they got to the little stone cottage where Jack's mum was there and had dinner waiting for them. They returned the next day and found the yarn Jack had left tied to the bush, and it disappeared under the roots of the oak tree. There was no sign of the laird. Jack did not wait long to put the gold ring on Jenny's finger, and soon after that they moved into the little stone cottage because Jack's mum had sold the sapphire and bought herself a lovely house on a loch where she lived happily ever after. So what of the wealthy laird? He was never seen again. The estate was given to his son, who turned out to be a much more generous employer than his father, and gave both Jenny and Jack a big pay rise. And they all lived happily ever after.